I'm back again with some more lost films to share with you all. Just in case you're new to this channel or this series, in each video we'll take a look at 3 lost films from the 1920s. First, some background, then a summary of the plot pieced together using reviews and magazines, and then we'll try to understand the reasons for the movie's success or failure. You don't have to watch previous videos in this series to understand this one, since these are all anthologies. But I do highly recommend watching the others to hear about more interesting stories about films that have probably disappeared forever. So, without further ado, let's jump into it. The first movie we're going to talk about today is The American Venus, released in 1926. Louise Brooks fans will probably recognize that title because it was her first substantial film role, but we'll talk more about that later. And a short disclaimer, the trailer for this movie has survived, so the video footage you'll see later on is in fact real footage from The American Venus. Alright, first a little background. The movie featured Fay Lamphere, a completely forgotten name now and one that barely registered even then. She was the winner of the 1925 Miss America pageant, which featured bathing beauty sort of young women popularized by Mack Sennett in the previous decade. Appropriately, the movie is about a beauty pageant. Shortly after the 1925 Miss America pageant had finished, the New York Evening Graphic alleged that the pageant had been rigged in favor of Fay Lamphere. But the graphic was a tabloid paper, so the credibility for its allegation is very low. It did, however, provide some possible publicity for The American Venus, though filming for it hadn't started yet. In the movie, Fay Lamphere played a beauty pageant participant, Miss Alabama, who was more of a minor character, but served an important purpose at the end. Esther Ralston played the main character, and Louise Brooks played another pageant participant, Miss Bayport, who seemed to have no real purpose in the story. Despite most reviews saying that the story was weak, some magazines wrote surprisingly detailed summaries of it. Some details are included in some, and others include different details, so I synthesized them into the most detailed narrative I could, and here it goes. The main character is a young woman named Mary Gray, who lives out west. Her father, John Gray, owns a cold cream business. He is in fierce competition with another man named Hugo Niles. Hugo's son, Horace, is engaged to Mary. Horace is described unflatteringly as pasty-souled. Because of the engagement of his son to John Gray's daughter, Hugo, who has the bigger company, chooses not to put John out of business. There is also a young publicity man for the Niles Company named Chip Armstrong, who suggests that Hugo enter a girl into the famous Atlantic City beauty pageant so that if she won, she could provide good national publicity for his product by citing it as the reason for her beauty. Hugo turns him down because he thinks his wife wouldn't approve of it. Chip sees that Mary Gray is very beautiful, so he defects to John Gray's company and gets Mary to enter into the pageant and becomes her publicity manager. Chip and Mary fall in love, and Mary breaks off her engagement with Horace. As the pageant progresses, it looks as though Mary will win. But now, with nothing holding him back from crushing John Gray's cold cream business, Hugo hatches a plot to sabotage Mary's chances in the pageant. Somehow, he passes on to Mary the lie that her father has been in a terrible accident back out west. Mary and Chip abandon the pageant and try to rush over to him. One way or another, they find out that it is a lie, and they try to rush back over to Atlantic City, unsure if they can make it back in time. They race there recklessly and dangerously in an automobile, and somehow manage not to get injured, but ultimately, they don't make it back to the pageant in time. With Mary now disqualified for not participating in the final part of the pageant, another winner is selected, Miss Alabama, who Mary had become friends with in the course of the pageant. But to Mary's joy, Miss Alabama tells the reporters that she owes her beauty to Gray's cold cream, and saves the day. So that was the story. I also want to mention that there were some Technicolor sequences as another novelty. One review described these sequences in a bit more detail, and mentioned that they included scenes on the boardwalk, in tableau, and in a fashion review. The tableau refers to tableaux vivants, which were like stationary scenes, often with elaborate and revealing costumes and interesting backdrops. Fortunately, I was able to find an example of one of these that was featured in The American Venus, and here it is. The full movie had a runtime between 70 and 80 minutes, and because the beauty element was focused on so much in the advertising and reviews, I imagine that the pageant scenes took up a big percentage of that. With many commenting on a weak story, perhaps the pageant scenes made up about half of the movie, maybe a little less, but that's just a guess. It is now a highly sought-after lost film for Louise Brooks fans, but how did it fare upon its release? Critically, the reviews were a bit mixed. Nearly every review I found mentions that the plot was thin, though for many of them, this wasn't fatal. Movie magazines were more positive since they were in the business of advertising female beauty to the public, and this couldn't have fit the bill more. Trade magazines tended to focus on the fact that the movie basically advertised for itself, and they seemed to expect at least modest success with it. Variety, however, was a bit more critical. The official review stated that the picture itself is an in-betweener, with a few laughs and no real dry spots, but on the other hand, no really hilarious moments. Just lots of female flesh and silk bathing suit beauties, all dressed so that the maximum of sex appeal will be reflected on the screen. In a far more conservative assessment in that same issue of Variety, the writer of an opinion piece could not get over the risque images it presented. They complained, "The American Venus, released by famous Players Lasky this week, is solely an attempt to make money through a display of women as nearly naked as they dare to show them. Silk bathing suits are used throughout under the pretext of displaying perfect forms selected by the Atlantic City judges of the last beauty contest. Brasiers have been discarded. To make the epidermis more luring, much of it is shown close-up in natural colors." And to that I say, of course the goal was to make money. That was, and still is, the goal of the movie industry. And it was following whatever it thought would make money, and feminine beauty in the modern style was extremely popular in the 1920s. I'm guessing that this article was written by one of the aging reformers from the Progressive era who were constantly lampooned by the younger set of the 1920s. It was exactly this sort of writer that the Exhibitor's Herald had in mind when it wrote in its review of The American Venus, "The scantiness of the girl's attire, though by no means vulgar, will undoubtedly offend the bigoted." But perhaps the most negative review I could find was a short one from a newspaper that said, "The American Venus is unmitigated ballyhoo, press agent puffery of the least mistakable sort, a sort of bench-made boob catcher, dedicated to readers of tabloid dailies and festooned with symbolic dollar signs. And this despite the fact that numerous first-rate talents have combined to produce it." One common observation that most reviewers made was that Fay Lamphere didn't have much photographic beauty. Despite the fact that she had won a national beauty pageant, photographic beauty was another thing entirely, and she seemed to have no future in the movie industry, another failed experiment. I think this can be compared to Babe Ruth and other athletes not being able to really break into Hollywood. Louise Brooks, on the other hand, was a welcome newcomer. She had previously made one film appearance before The American Venus, but it was only a small, uncredited extra part, so she was a complete unknown in movies. Her very appealing physical beauty was used to great advantage, and seemed to be a highlight of the movie for some. Picture Play magazine even went so far as to say, "Louise is the young lady with the black hair who saved the American Venus from a fate worse than death." Reviewers themselves wrote few details other than simply complimenting her looks, and that was probably her character's only real purpose. But how did it fare with the public? Good, but not great. I did find one blurb citing a very profitable week for it at one big theater, but there were many more smaller theaters recording relatively smaller returns. We can get somewhat of an impression from a small sampling of box office returns reported in the trade magazine Motion Picture News, which had a 4-point scale taken from exhibitor self-reports to roughly measure the box office success of a movie. The American Venus tally showed 3 reports of 2 out of 4 points, 19 reports of 3 out of 4 points, and 2 reports of 4 out of 4 points, with an average value of 69 out of 100%. While this sample size is obviously very small, there was clearly a general consensus that it fared okay. Comparing it to the other films released around the same time, it was about average. Maybe it's a bit difficult for some to understand why this wasn't a bigger movie. To many of us 1920s nerds, it might seem to be a dream come true. Beautiful 1920s women in skimpy bathing suits, sometimes even in Technicolor. It would certainly be good B-roll footage for this channel. But keep in mind that there was a part of the adult population who simply didn't approve of this kind of epidermis exposure, and wouldn't have been interested in seeing it. And it should also be noted that beautiful women were nothing new in the movie industry of the 1920s, and it was often oversaturated with them. Despite being too scandalous for some, for others it wasn't modern enough. The review in the movie magazine Picture Play said the concept of the movie was outdated, and elaborated more along these lines, possibly giving a hint about why the movie wasn't too successful. The American Venus is a throwback to the old Cecil DeMille days, when a pretty leg or a one-piece bathing suit held the popular attention. It is as gaudy as a Christmas tree without nearly so much interest. In fact, as one scene after another, crammed with girls in various stages of attire, passed before me, I thought the world had turned back 10 years. This terrific setback to the industry must have cost lots and lots of money, taken a long time to make, and kept many dressmakers busy sewing for months, and yet it's all just a big mistake. Perhaps there just wasn't enough to make it stand out from other beauty-focused movies. If it had been made a year or two later, when Louise Brooks was at the height of her relevance in Hollywood and given a more engaging story, perhaps it would have done better. And timing is really important for such entertainment with a novelty element. The bathing beauty trend had been around for over a decade by the time The American Venus was released. The original Miss America pageant in Atlantic City had its origins in 1921, and was discontinued for a number of years after the 1927 pageant, the year after The American Venus was released, which could definitely be a sign that interest had flagged by that point. And remember that pop culture things like this came and went very rapidly in the 1920s, so this wouldn't be surprising at all. Next, we have a film adaptation of a novel. I've talked about some of these before, like The Great Gatsby and The Beautiful and the Damned from Part 1. This time, we have the movie adaptation of one of my new favorite 1920s novels, Main Street, written by Sinclair Lewis. Lewis might have been the most famous American writer in the 1920s, and his novels skillfully rode the line of widespread appeal and acceptance in the literary world. And at the time, Lewis's mainstream relevance certainly lasted longer than the likes of F. Scott Fitzgerald's. After Fitzgerald largely faded away from popularity in the second half of the 1920s, Lewis was still writing massive bestsellers. Lewis's first hit of the 1920s was Main Street, published in 1920. To say that it was huge is a bit of an understatement. Despite not having quite the long-lasting legacy of other sleeper hit novels, it was in the running for the most popular novel of the 1920s as a whole. It was the best-selling novel of 1921, and was voted to win the Pulitzer Prize for Literature that same year. But this decision was actually overturned, which was apparently something that could happen. Given such widespread popularity and critical success, it was almost inevitable that Main Street would be made into a movie, and after about 2 years, Warner Brothers took on the job. The negative of the movie was junked by the studio in 1948, and that seems to be the last known mention of any surviving copy. If you want a detailed summary and analysis of the novel Main Street, you can check out my video on that. If not, don't worry, because the movie's story deviates from the novel quite a bit anyway. It was a bit difficult to find detailed summaries for the movie because I'm sure reviewers just assumed that people knew the basic premise of the book since it was so popular, but here is a mostly complete reconstruction of the movie's summary. The main character is a young woman named Carol, played by Florence Vidor, who is from the city. She marries a doctor named Will Kennicott, played by Monty Blue, and thus becomes Carol Kennicott. She agrees to move with him to his hometown of Gopher Prairie, a very small town. It is presented as a typical American small town with one main street, which is where the title comes from. Carol has trouble fitting in with the townsfolk, and her ideals are often diametrically opposed to those of the locals. She wants to reform the town, to make it more sophisticated and respectable, but she has little luck in changing the stubborn, unchanging attitude of Gopher Prairie. Her difficulty of adjusting to small-town life reveals that Will Kennicott doesn't really understand his new wife all that well. While Will is kind and a faithful husband, this situation isolates the couple a bit. Carol finds friendship with some outsiders in town, namely a Swedish servant girl named Bee Sorensen and a young man named Eric Valborg. Eric falls in love with Carol and asks her to run away with him and get married, but Carol refuses. Eric's father has a grudge against Will because Will felt it necessary to amputate the man's arm. This grudge extends to Carol, at the very least due to association. So when Eric's father sees his son with her, he denounces Carol to the town. The townsfolk turn on Carol, but then Will comes to Carol's defense and tells the mob off. Eric then admits that Carol is innocent of this accusation of indecency. Now Carol sees Will's love for her in action, but also realizes that she will never be able to change Gopher Prairie or its people. Alright, so that's where the movie ends. Maybe. Although I did find one single blurb in Exhibitor's trade review that stated that in the movie, Carol goes to live in Washington alone, and Will eventually comes to see her to reconcile, just like in the book. We can't always rely 100% on the accuracy of these reviews, and the fact that I could only find one that mentioned this seemingly important development is a bit suspicious, but I digress. If you've read the book, you're probably wondering where many of the characters were in the movie story. We briefly heard of B. Sorensen, but little more than a mention. And where's Miles Bjornstam? Where's Guy Pollock? Where's Vida Sherwin, Fern Mullins, Olaf Bjornstam, or Carol and Will's children? Some of those characters were present in the movie, but not all. Here is a list of all the credited characters. We can see that Miles is there, as is Guy Pollock, but important characters in the book like Vida Sherwin and Fern Mullins are nowhere to be seen. There is a very understandable reason for this. Main Street the novel is long, with a lot of characters. Main Street the movie already had a list of characters considerably longer than normal. There just wasn't enough room for all of them. The bigger mystery for me is, for the side characters in the movie, what did they actually do? All of the summaries I found focused exclusively on the main storyline with Carol, Will, and Eric, but there was little mention of how the others were used. B. Sorensen, played by Louise Fazenda, was apparently some sort of comic relief. The purpose of B was probably just for that, rather than for moving the story along. As for Miles Bjornstam, I couldn't find anything about what he did in the movie. In the book, Miles serves as the antithesis of Gopher Prairie, so his symbolic importance was crucial to the commentary. The movie seemed to be content just using Eric Valborg for similar purposes. As in the book, he represented everything Carol thought she wanted. I also couldn't find out if Miles and Bee get married as they do in the book, and if they didn't get married, then their son Olaf wouldn't be there either. There was also no mention of Carol and Will's children. And then there's the Fern Mullins episode. Like I said before, there probably just wasn't enough room for it, and my theory is that it was too inappropriate to include anyway. In the book, Fern is a school teacher who is accused of being romantically involved with one of her older students and giving him alcohol, and she gets viciously run out of town, despite none of it being true. Her career was permanently ruined by the scandal. Even though the movie didn't completely avoid lampooning small-town folks, that storyline was probably a bit too brutal for theaters, since it really exposes the ugliest side of the people of Gopher Prairie. The makers of this movie probably felt the need to walk the line so as not to completely distort the message of the novel, but also not offend small-town viewers too much. But I don't want to focus too much more on the differences between the movie and the book, though I do want to mention one more thing. Reviews for the movie talk quite a bit about a big winter ice carnival event that Warner Brothers spent a lot of time and money putting together. I couldn't really find out how it fit into the story, but I did find an interesting behind-the-scenes description of the whole thing that I'll quote in full. What is described as a snowstorm deluxe, in the sense that it is a dazzling spectacle of a winter carnival, was filmed at the Warner Studios. The entire set is said to have been covered with white sand, tons of fine salt, and a composition which made it glisten like the real thing. A huge ski slide was constructed and covered with ice, at the bottom of which was a large frozen pond. 3 professional ski jumpers were engaged for this particular scene, and a number of professional skaters gave exhibitions of fancy skating. For this carnival, fully 1,000 extras are reported to have been engaged, and it took 3 nights to film the scenes which culminated in a blizzard. Okay, now let's turn to some reviews. One newspaper went so far as to say that Main Street was one of the greatest pictures the motion picture industry has turned out, and put it up in the ranks with recent hits like The Covered Wagon and Robin Hood. A magazine review said positively of the movie, "In filming Sinclair Lewis's widely read novel, they have taken a story, basically a vivid character drawing with the plot seemingly intangible, and made it a living, breathing picture panorama fairly saturated with love interest, human touches, and good everyday hokum that will get anybody anywhere, in the tank towns as well as the first-run theaters." Director Harry Beaumont has injected a potent message, humanly told, with romance, suspense, and comedy so exquisitely blended that it cannot help but make people want to see it time and time again. It is a great picture for the women in the audience. Mr. Exhibitor, book Main Street by all means. Just tell the town you have it and sit back and watch the shekels roll in at the box office. Then when the show is over, watch the audience leave with that happy, contented grin on its face that is always there when a picture makes a big hit, especially with the women, as does Main Street. The movie magazine Screenland wrote in its review, "But it is a corking good picture. Hokum? Yes, gobs of it, of the surefire kind that keeps an audience in an uproar or a titter or in tears. Very cunningly, the picture does what the book failed to do. It leaves you with a feeling that Main Street is about as broad after all as Fifth Avenue, that futile discontent and snobbish gropings for vague ideas are less lovely than honest ugliness." Other reviews of the premiere said that the movie was too long and would have to be cut. And Variety said that it was, in fact, cut down considerably after the premiere. And with the more negative reviews, we have to address the elephant in the room, the relationship between the book and the movie and how that affected the movie's reception. Nearly every review, positive or negative, said that the movie was very different from the book. This cannot be surprising to anyone even today, where we still have debates about the same exact problem. Those who gave their reviews a positive spin sometimes said something to the effect of what Exhibitor's Herald wrote in its review. "If you haven't read the book, you'll enjoy Main Street on the screen with greater relish than those who have already perused the much-discussed Sinclair Lewis novel." Photoplay commented on the predictable outcome of adapting such a novel to film. "We anticipated failure in the transfer of Sinclair Lewis's Main Street to the screen. Only a great director could transfer either the physical or the mental side of the Lewis study in small-townism. Only he could capture the microscopic detail of Lewis's word painting or catch the mental clash of the characters. Yet for two reels, this film, Main Street, is good." Now, regarding that last sentence, it should be noted that Main Street was listed as having 8 reels. From the exhibitor's perspective, there was some concern about the content and message of the movie negatively affecting interest in small-town theaters. While the movie appears to have toned down the biting satire at small-town folks' expense, it still made them out to be nosy, bullheaded, and decidedly unprogressive. One movie magazine spoke to this. "We quarrel with the general conception of the inhabitants of Gopher Prairie. There is a marked tendency to make them the types you find cast in stories of small towns for comedy relief. It doesn't seem to us that they should be just that." An anonymous person wrote a letter to the editor of Motion Picture Magazine about how they didn't expect such a movie like Main Street to be successful in small towns. "For more than a year, the public has been treated to stories about small towns. Pictures like Main Street leave a kind of distaste in the mouth after seeing them. Most people in small towns live like the people in these pictures, and that is the main reason why they are distasteful. These people like to see a picture that takes them away from the cares of their daily lives, and the small town plays bring said cares back to them. They like to forget everything around them and lose themselves in the picture. People in the same position as Carol Kennicott would become discouraged when reading the book or seeing the play of Main Street." Oh yeah, I forgot to mention before that a Main Street stage play was also made in 1921. So overall, Main Street was probably a fairly decent movie, though might have been disappointing if you were a fan of the book. Everyone praised the cast for their performances, so no problems there. It was predictable and understandable that the movie couldn't possibly explore the small-town psyche as deeply or on the same scale as the book for time constraints alone. And though the movie is lost, we still have the book, and I can't recommend it enough. So check it out if you're interested, or check out my video about it for a short discussion. The last film I want to talk about in this video is Remodelling Her Husband, released in 1920. The main reason why this movie is remembered at all is because it was the only film that actress Lillian Gish ever directed. Gish was at her peak of fame in 1920, along with her sister Dorothy. While Lillian usually did more dramatic roles, Dorothy was known for her comedy, and interestingly, Dorothy had the main role in Remodeling Her Husband. And as a side note, it's possible, though not confirmed, that D.W. Griffith also had some input in the movie as well. What might be just as interesting as Lillian Gish directing is that she and Dorothy also wrote the script. According to a later account by Lillian, Dorothy got the idea for the script in a magazine cartoon. And the writer for the intertitles was writer Dorothy Parker, famous for her wit and satire. Although it seems like Dorothy Parker's involvement in the movie hasn't been completely confirmed. So that means that the writers, the director, and the leading player for this movie were all women. Lillian Gish was certainly not the first woman to direct a movie. Neither she nor her sister were the first women to write a movie script. Dorothy Parker was not the first woman to write intertitles. And Dorothy Gish was obviously not the first top-billed movie actress. But this combination was definitely a bit unusual, and the director role was the one most uncommonly filled by women, especially in Hollywood. But what was the movie about? Fortunately, there was a short story version published in the movie magazine Motion Picture Classic, so the story is known in detail. And without that print version, I would have had about half as many movie stills for this section of the video. However, it's hard to tell how many of the details were actually in the film version, so I didn't include some of the ones from the short story version if it seemed like it didn't match with what the movie reviewers said. And of course, the movie wouldn't have had nearly as much spoken dialogue as in the short story version. But anyway, here's the summary. The setting is New York City. The main character is a woman named Janie Wakefield, who marries a flirty man named Jack Valentine. Janie doesn't like Jack's flirty ways, and he promises to change. But one day, while she was shopping on Fifth Avenue, Janie sees Jack helping a blonde woman with her suitcase as she gets into a taxi, and then rides in the taxi with her and leads the woman to the door of her house. Janie had found this out because she followed his taxi in another taxi, and then she apparently saw him kiss her, presumably on the cheek. This was all purely innocent, according to Jack later on, but Janie doesn't know that at the time and assumes the worst. Jack is eventually able to convince her that it wasn't what she thought it was. But not long after that, Jack falls for another woman, Mabel, who is a manicurist. Mabel was actually Janie's manicurist, and one day Jack says he thinks he should get a manicure for himself. Janie, not suspicious, recommends Mabel to him. But one day, Janie sees the flirtatious look that Jack gives Mabel, and she starts to have doubts. Janie returns unexpectedly early from another shopping excursion to find Jack and Mabel doing something other than manicuring, probably an intimate kiss. Seeing this makes Janie flee home to her mother, and then she gets a job at her father's office and becomes rather successful. Jack tries to contact Janie through letters, but she burns them. He tries to call her, but she won't take the calls and ignores his messages. Jack truly does love Janie, so he is distraught and tries to win her back. Somehow, he finds out where she's working and he goes to her. Janie, not in a forgiving mood, pushes the button on her desk to have Jack escorted out of the building. While being taken away, Jack threatens to kill himself, and Janie caves to her feelings for him and they reconcile again. Finding reviews for Remodeling Her Husband was not as easy as the two previous movies, but from the reactions I did find, it was not positive. One review from Exhibitors Herald was pretty cynical about it when it said, "Someone should take Lillian to one side and tell her to stick to acting and let others do the directing of her sister's plays." Remodeling Her Husband is Lillian's first offense to the critics, who will probably treat it charitably for this reason. But whoever it is around the famous Players Plat that passes on its finished product was certainly asleep the day they slipped this one by. It is a very amateurish piece of work. There is a point here. Lillian Gish was very popular and well-respected in Hollywood in 1920. She was comparable to Mary Pickford in many ways. She usually played innocent ingenues, and that innocent image was often projected onto her as a person, and nobody wants to hurt an ingenue. So it's not hard to see how the industry and critics might have wanted to be nice about her debut so as not to hurt her feelings or offend her. But if that really was the case, then a lot of small, soft criticisms might be amplified to show the true reactions. One review from the movie magazine Motion Picture Classic may have been trying to cushion the fall when it said, "After observing Remodeling Her Husband, we are confident that Lillian Gish could easily develop into a director of fine originality." You could interpret it to mean that she wasn't a director of fine originality yet, in a sort of soft criticism, but that the review leaves the future possibility hanging in the air as a convenient out. But they would never find out because Lillian Gish never directed another movie. Some, possibly in blind defense of Lillian's reputation, thought that the story was to blame. To be sure, it isn't an entirely interesting story in itself, and seemed very standard fare for the time. It often takes a very skilled and experienced director to turn something so normal into something of real substance. But of course, this was Lillian's first attempt at directing. She would later write that she just had a craving to direct a movie, and after it was finished, she didn't really want to do it again. It was just an experiment for her. It's not like the movie took a big risk anyway. It was given a modest budget, was finished in a month, and did alright at the box office. What pretty much everyone did agree on was that Dorothy Gish playing the lead role was as entertaining as ever. Despite a rather conventional plot and a novice director, Dorothy didn't disappoint. The trade magazine Motion Picture News went as far as to say that Dorothy saved the picture from total failure, saying, "Only the presence of Dorothy Gish, with her undeniable charm and inimitable comedy, saves this piece from becoming a tiresome entertainment. We can think of no other actress who can endow the tried-and-true role of the young bride, whose object is to tame her husband, with so much color and personality. Whatever appeal this picture has is found in her performance. There are moments when the action drags, but for the most part, Dorothy Gish is there sending out shafts of her quaint humor." Variety chimed in by saying, "It is a picture that is Dorothy Gish hook, line, and sinker, and it would sink if it weren't for her." So it is very clear who the winner was among the two sisters in this situation. One particular scene that I saw cited a couple times was where Janie tries humorously to attract men in a public park. This was the most memorable part of the movie for some who wrote about it, but I have no idea where in the movie this scene happened. Despite this movie being a comedy drama, the summaries and reviews didn't really reflect the comedy aspect very much, probably because it was incidental to the story. The drama propelled the story, and the comedy might have been inserted as a kind of distraction, or as an attempt to give the movie a kind of emotional roller coaster effect. From everything I could find, it seems that the consensus was that Remodeling Her Husband was, at best, nothing special. But knowing that it was the legendary Lillian Gish's only directed movie, it will never fail to make us wonder what it was actually like. I mean, after all, it might not have been as bad as the reviews made it out to be. To everyone who made it this far, thank you so much for getting to the end. Here's a random 1920s photo to show my appreciation. So, which of these 3 movies would you like to see the most? Let me know in the comments. Well, that's all for now, all you sheiks and gals out there, but stay tuned for more tales from the Jazz Age.